"Sir, put the groceries down and step away from the vehicle." The command cut through the late afternoon air so sharply that even the shopping carts seemed to stop rattling. In the far corner of the Fresh Mart parking lot, under a sky the color of cold steel, Marcus Ellison slowly turned from the open trunk of his dark blue sedan with a gallon of milk in one hand and a paper bag tucked against his hip. For half a second, he said nothing. The fluorescent lights above the storefront had already begun to glow, reflecting off damp blacktops still slick from a passing drizzle, and around him the ordinary sounds of suburban life hummed on, as if nothing strange were happening at all. A child asked for candy near the entrance. A cart rolled loose across painted lines. Somewhere behind the glass doors, a scanner beeped in fast, mechanical bursts. Marcus looked like exactly what he was, a man in his late 30s picking up groceries after work. His charcoal button-down was neat, but not expensive, sleeves folded once at the wrist. His tie had been loosened and tucked into his coat pocket. There was tiredness in his eyes, the kind carried by people who spent their days holding themselves together for everyone else. He had stopped for whole wheat bread, low-sodium soup, tea, fresh fruit, and the arthritis prescription cream his mother liked from aisle 12 because she said the name-brand one worked better than the generic. That was all. Nothing in his posture was aggressive. Nothing in his face was hurried. But Officer Derek Shaw stood 3 feet away with the kind of suspicion that did not need evidence to feel justified. He was white, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, with mirrored sunglasses still on despite the fading light, one hand resting near his belt as though the scene in front of him had already become something larger in his mind. Marcus set the milk down carefully beside the trunk and lifted his free hand just enough to show he meant no trouble. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice even, calm, practiced. The words were polite, but they landed in the cooling air with a weight that came from long experience. People nearby had begun to notice. A woman loading bottled water into an SUV slowed and stared. 2 teenage boys near the cart returned, stopped talking, and turned their heads. An elderly man paused halfway into his pickup, keys still dangling from his fingers. The atmosphere shifted in that subtle American way, not loud at first, just tight, as if everyone sensed the moment had stepped off its rails. Officer Shaw took one more look at Marcus, then at the sedan, then back at Marcus, and somehow the groceries at his feet seemed to disappear from the story Shaw had already chosen to tell himself. "I asked you to step away from the car," he said, firmer now. Marcus obeyed without argument. He moved exactly 1 step back, palms visible, breathing measured, while the open trunk framed cartons, apples, and a bouquet of yellow flowers tucked between 2 bags. Flowers for his mother. They looked almost impossibly soft against the cold geometry of the parking lot. Shaw's jaw tightened. Marcus saw it then, the thing beneath procedure, beneath tone, beneath the uniform itself. He had seen it before in elevators, in courthouse lobbies, in upscale stores where eyes followed him a second too long. It was not confusion. It was conclusion. And in that instant, with the damp wind brushing across the asphalt and strangers beginning to reach for their phones, Marcus understood this was no longer about groceries at all. Officer Shaw did not raise his voice again, but somehow the silence that followed felt heavier than a shout. It settled over the parking lot in layers, pressing down on every small sound until even the scrape of a shopping cart felt too loud. Marcus Ellison stood with his hands visible and his shoulders relaxed, but inside, his thoughts had already sharpened into something precise and familiar. He knew this terrain. Not the painted lines of the Fresh Mart lot, not the glow of the red sale signs reflected in the storefront glass, but the invisible ground beneath it, the place where suspicion became authority and authority pretended to be reason. He had spent years inside federal buildings where men in tailored suits spoke elegantly about justice while quietly making room for bias at the table. He had learned early that the most dangerous moments were not always the loud ones. Sometimes they arrived with calm voices, clipped instructions, and a look that said a decision had already been made long before facts were invited in. "Do you mind telling me why I am being stopped?" Marcus asked. His tone remained steady, respectful, almost soft. He did not speak like a man trying to win an argument in public. He spoke like a man documenting the first sentence of a record that might matter later. Shaw glanced toward the trunk again, then toward the interior of the sedan, as if the answer might appear there if he stared hard enough. We got a report, he said. Vehicle matching this description. Possible theft. The explanation hung in the air, thin and unfinished. Marcus looked at his own car, then back at the officer. The sedan was clean, modest, and clearly registered, with a university parking decal still clinging to the lower corner of the windshield from years ago. There was nothing dramatic about it. Nothing urgent. Nothing that matched the shape of danger except the story being built around the man standing beside it. This vehicle is registered to me, Marcus said. My identification is in my wallet, inside my jacket pocket. Nearby, the woman by the SUV had not resumed unloading her water. One of the teenage boys had lifted his phone, not high, not obvious, just enough. A breeze passed through the lot carrying the smell of rain, hot rotisserie chicken from the deli vents, and gasoline from the pumps across the access road. Ordinary American life continued all around them, and that made the moment stranger somehow. A man could be one stop away from home, buying soup for his mother and flowers to brighten her kitchen table, and still become a problem in someone else's imagination. Marcus thought of his mother then, waiting in her small brick house 12 minutes away, probably standing at the sink in her house shoes, looking out through the lace curtains to see whether his headlights had turned into the driveway yet. She would ask why he bought the expensive tea again. She would complain about the price, and then smile while setting the kettle on the stove. He had promised he would not be long. The yellow flowers in the trunk were daisies because she said roses tried too hard. That thought almost grounded him until Shaw stepped closer and asked, "Why are you nervous?" Marcus nearly smiled at the question, not because it was funny, but because of how old it was, how rehearsed, how often fear was assigned to the person being cornered instead of the system creating the corner. "I am not nervous," he said. "I am being careful." Something flickered across Shaw's face then, not confusion, not yet anger, but irritation at being met with calm instead of collapse. People like Shaw expected one of two things: submission that looked like guilt, or frustration that could be used against you. Marcus offered neither. He simply stood there in the damp evening light, composed and unmistakably dignified, while the officer's version of the scene began to strain against the facts visible to everyone else. From the far edge of the lot, a young woman in a green sweatshirt slowed near the cart return, looked directly at Marcus, then at the officer, and quietly opened the camera app on her phone. Marcus noticed the movement from the corner of his eye and said nothing. He did not need to. The air had changed again. Witnesses were no longer just watching. They were remembering. The young woman in the green sweatshirt held her phone low at first, almost at chest level, the way people do when they are not yet sure whether what they are seeing is real or whether they will regret getting involved. Her name was Lena Brooks, 24, still wearing her hospital badge from the end of a double shift, hair pulled back, sneakers damp from the weather, exhaustion resting faintly beneath her eyes. She had come to Fresh Mart for frozen waffles, orange juice, and the extra-strength peppermint tea her grandmother liked when her knees acted up in the cold. She had no reason to stop in that parking lot. No reason except the look on Marcus Ellison's face, that controlled stillness that did not read as guilt or panic, only restraint. It was a look she recognized. Her older brother used to wear it whenever he got pulled aside in stores and asked questions nobody asked their white friends. So Lena did what people in America have learned to do when truth starts slipping sideways in public. She hit record. The lens caught the blue sedan, the open trunk, the bouquet of yellow daisies resting against a bag of apples, and Officer Derek Shaw standing just close enough to turn a routine stop into something personal. Marcus remained exactly where he was, hands visible, posture measured, the damp evening light glazing the shoulders of his shirt. "Officer," he said, "I am asking again. On the record, why I am being detained." There was no challenge in his tone, only clarity. A clean sentence. A man laying down markers in real time. Shaw shifted his weight and looked briefly toward the growing circle of bystanders. That was the first sign the situation was no longer moving entirely on his terms. More people had slowed now. A mother buckling her child into a car seat paused with the door still open. Two store employees in red aprons lingered just outside the sliding entrance, pretending to straighten a row of shopping baskets while watching everything. The teenage boys had stepped closer to each other, whispering under their breath. And through it all, the fluorescent lights from the storefront gave every face a pale, almost courtroom glow. "I said we received a report," Shaw answered. You fit the description. Marcus let the words settle. He did not rush to fill the silence after them. That silence mattered. It stretched just long enough for everyone listening to hear what was missing. What description? What report? What actual reason? Lena's camera picked up the sound of a loose cart tapping lightly against a curb somewhere behind her. It also caught the faint tremor in the officer's voice, almost imperceptible, but there. Marcus turned his head slightly, just enough to glance toward the trunk, where one paper bag had tipped sideways and a box of chamomile tea sat near the edge. The groceries are for my mother, he said. She is expecting me home. There was something about that line, simple and domestic, that changed the temperature of the scene again. It reminded everyone standing there that this was not a mystery unfolding under stadium lights or in some dark alley full of shadows. This was a son on his way home with soup, tea, and flowers. It was so ordinary that the suspicion surrounding him began to look obscene in its own emptiness. Shaw followed Marcus's glance to the trunk and then quickly away from it, as if those details complicated the story he preferred. Keep your eyes on me, he said. Marcus did. Calmly. Fully. No flinch, no sigh, no sudden motion. Just a steady gaze that seemed to say he had seen this mechanism before and knew exactly how it fed on reaction. Lena stepped a little closer without realizing it, drawn by the quiet gravity of the moment. From her phone screen, Marcus looked less like a man being questioned and more like a witness standing inside his own case before the paperwork had even begun. Then Shaw asked for identification, and the parking lot seemed to hold its breath all over again, because everyone knew what could happen in the space between permission and movement, between a pocket and an assumption, between a man reaching slowly for a wallet and someone deciding not to believe what his hands were doing. Marcus did not move right away. He let the request hang there for one careful breath, not out of defiance, but because he understood how fragile moments like this could become when another person was determined to misunderstand them. The parking lot lights hummed overhead. Rainwater clung to the edge of the open trunk and gathered into slow drops that fell onto the bumper one by one. Somewhere near the entrance, a child laughed at something small and ordinary, and the sound felt almost surreal against the tightness spreading across the asphalt. My wallet is in the inside pocket of my jacket, Marcus said. If I reach for it, I'm going to use my right hand slowly. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of someone used to speaking in rooms where every word could become part of the record. Officer Shaw gave a short nod, but there was impatience in it, not permission so much as irritation that Marcus insisted on naming each step out loud. Marcus moved exactly as he said he would. Slow, visible, measured. His fingers slipped into the jacket pocket and drew out a dark leather wallet worn soft at the edges from years of use. He held it up slightly, not high enough to feel theatrical, just enough that everyone watching could see the ordinary object for what it was. Lena's camera caught the moment cleanly, the wallet, the still open trunk, the yellow daisies, the officer's rigid posture. Marcus opened the wallet with care and removed his identification card. The plastic surface reflected the white glare of the lot lights. He extended it forward. Shaw took it, barely glancing at Marcus before looking down. The shift in his face was immediate, though small enough that only someone paying close attention would catch it. His mouth tightened. His eyes flicked once across the card, then again, slower this time. Marcus saw that too. So did Lena. The card was not flashy. No gold trim, no dramatic seal meant for television. Just a federal identification card with Marcus Ellison's name, photograph, and title beneath it, plain and official in the quiet way real power often is. For the first time since this began, Shaw looked less certain of his own script. But instead of stepping back, instead of allowing the facts to gently correct the situation, he seemed to stiffen inside them. Pride has a strange way of deepening a mistake after truth arrives. Federal Prosecutor, Shaw read aloud, as if testing whether the words sounded absurd in the damp evening air. A murmur moved through the bystanders, low and rippling. The mother by the SUV stopped pretending not to listen. One of the red apron employees raised his brows and looked at his coworker. The teenage boys exchanged a glance that held both surprise and something else, a quiet recognition that the world had just turned, but not all the way. Marcus kept his hands at his sides. Yes, he said, and I am advising you, respectfully, that this stop appears unsupported. The phrase was precise, almost gentle, but it landed with force because it was so clean. Not emotional. Not dramatic. Just true. Shaw handed the card back a second too slowly. That does not mean you cannot be questioned, he said. No, Marcus replied. It does not. But it does mean you should know exactly what you are doing. The words settled into the cold air between them like a line drawn in chalk. Lena felt something tighten in her chest as she listened. Marcus was not trying to embarrass the officer. That was what made the moment sharper. He was still offering a path back to dignity, still leaving room for the other man to correct himself in public and walk away with whatever remained of his judgment. But Shaw did not take it. Instead, he glanced toward Lena's phone, then toward the small crowd, and in that brief sweep of the eyes, something ugly and unmistakable surfaced, not loud, not spoken, but visible enough. He was not thinking about safety anymore. He was thinking about authority, about being seen losing it, about what it meant that the man standing in front of him had both composure and credentials. And that was when Marcus understood the evening was moving into a more dangerous kind of silence, the kind that comes just before a person with power decides whether truth matters more than pride. Officer Shaw did not step back. The card had told him who Marcus was, but the knowledge seemed only to harden something in him, as if facts were now a personal insult instead of a correction. The parking lot had gone strangely still. Even the automatic doors behind the checkout lane seemed to slide open more quietly, releasing shoppers into the cold air with faces already turned toward the scene. Marcus could feel the weight of their attention, not as pressure, but as proof. They had seen enough to know this was no misunderstanding. The yellow daisies in the trunk leaned slightly in the breeze, brushing against a paper bag stamped with the store logo, and for one brief second Marcus focused on that small movement to steady himself. He thought of his mother setting those flowers in the chipped blue vase near her kitchen window. He thought of the tea cooling in the bag and the soup she would pretend she did not need. He thought of how ordinary this evening had been an hour ago, and how quickly ordinary things could be dragged into someone else's fear. I am going to ask one more time, Marcus said, his voice still level, still controlled. Am I free to leave? It was a simple question, one that narrowed the world down to its legal bones. Lena's phone stayed trained on both men. On the screen, Marcus looked calm enough to be standing outside a courthouse instead of a grocery store, while Shaw looked increasingly like a man trying to outrun the truth with posture alone. Shaw drew in a breath through his nose and glanced toward the small crowd again. That glance said everything. He was no longer deciding what was lawful. He was deciding what would look like surrender. No, he said at last. Not yet. The words landed flat and wrong. Marcus did not react outwardly, but something colder passed behind his eyes. Then I am being detained, he said. On what basis? Shaw gave no real answer. He shifted to procedure, to vague language, to that familiar official fog that appears when reasons cannot survive daylight. He spoke about reports, about matching descriptions, about the need to verify. But none of it connected. None of it held. The bystanders could feel that now. The mother by the SUV closed her car door and took 2 steps closer. One of the store employees in the red apron pulled out his own phone. The teenage boys were no longer whispering. They were listening. Marcus slowly exhaled. Officer Shaw, he said, reading the nameplate without heat. I need you to understand that every unnecessary minute of this stop matters. Shaw's jaw flexed. You do not tell me how to do my job. Marcus met his gaze. I do not need to. That line moved through the crowd like a current. Not because it was loud. Because it was quiet. Because it came from a place deeper than anger. Marcus was not trying to win the parking lot. He was simply refusing to shrink inside it. Shaw seemed to sense that too, and it unsettled him more than resistance would have. He took out his radio and spoke into it, requesting another unit in a tone that tried to sound routine. But routine had already left the scene. The second Lena heard the words backup requested, her stomach tightened. This was how simple things became larger than they ever should have. She stepped a little closer and said, clearly enough for her phone to capture it, he already showed you identification. Shaw cut his eyes toward her. Ma'am, stay out of police business. Lena did not lower the phone. I am standing in a public parking lot, she said, voice shaking only slightly. And I am recording. Marcus turned his head just enough to register her presence, and in that tiny movement something passed between them. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition. The kind that lives between strangers when one person refuses to let another disappear inside a lie. Red and blue lights suddenly washed across the wet blacktop as a second patrol car rolled into the lot. Its headlights swung over the open trunk, the groceries, the flowers, the small circle of witnesses. The scene, already tense, seemed to pull tighter. Marcus stood motionless in the center of it, a man carrying nothing now but his own composure, while Officer Shaw straightened his shoulders as if help had arrived to protect his version of the truth. But the cameras were already up, the witnesses were already watching, and somewhere beyond the clouds, evening was falling. Fast enough to make every light in that parking lot feel harsh and permanent. The second patrol car stopped at an angle near the cart return, its headlights cutting pale lanes across the wet pavement and throwing long reflections beneath Marcus's shoes. A younger officer stepped out, white, broad-faced, maybe 30, with the restless energy of someone still learning how quickly a scene could define him. His name tag read Collins. He took one look at Marcus, one look at Officer Shaw, then at the growing knot of shoppers and raised phones, and his expression tightened in that cautious way people do when they know they have arrived in the middle of something already wrong. "What do we have?" he asked. Shaw answered before anyone else could. "Possible vehicle theft. Subject is being uncooperative." The word hung there, ugly in its laziness. Marcus turned his head slightly and looked at Collins, not pleading, not performing, just offering him the chance to hear a human voice before the paperwork of assumption sealed around him. "I have identified myself," Marcus said. "I'm on my way to bring groceries to my mother. My identification has already been verified." Collins's eyes flicked toward Shaw. It was the smallest movement, but it carried hesitation. He had heard enough already to know the story was not clean. Lena caught all of it on her phone. The tension in Collins's jaw, the impatience in Shaw's stance, the controlled stillness in Marcus's face. A gust of wind lifted the corner of one paper bag in the trunk, and a box of tea tipped sideways, then settled. The daisies trembled again. Marcus noticed the flowers and felt a brief ache pass through him. Not dramatic, not loud, just deeply tired. He had spent so much of his life learning how to move carefully through rooms that were never built with him in mind. School hallways where teachers praised his discipline before they learned his name. Courtrooms where opposing counsel mistook him for support staff. Luxury stores where clerks asked if he needed help finding the sale rack, while white men in wrinkled golf shirts walked unnoticed toward watches locked behind glass. None of it had made him bitter. That was the miracle and the burden of men like him. He still believed in the system even after the system kept asking him to prove he deserved to be treated like a citizen inside it. Collins stepped closer, lowering his voice a little. "Sir, if you have identification, maybe we can clear this up." Marcus held his gaze. It was already shown. Another silence. The kind that reveals more than speech. Collins looked at Shaw again, and Shaw answered the glance with the hard stare of a superior who did not want questions in public. Behind them, the store doors opened and shut, releasing brief rectangles of warm light onto the dark lot. A man in a denim jacket stopped pushing his cart and simply stood there, not pretending to shop anymore. The mother by the SUV folded her arms tightly against the cold. One of the teenage boys whispered, "This is messed up," and for once nobody told him to be quiet. Lena felt her pulse in her fingertips as she recorded. She had not planned to be here. She had not planned to become a witness. But now that she understood something with sudden clarity. The real turning point in moments like this was not always the arrival of truth. Sometimes truth had already arrived and been ignored. The turning point was whether anyone else would stand close enough to keep it from being buried. Marcus spoke again, softer now, but every word landed. "Officer Collins, I need you to listen carefully. This stop is not supported by articulable facts. My credentials were presented. I have complied. And every minute this continues without basis increases the damage." Collins swallowed. He was not stupid. He knew what those words meant, and more importantly, he knew who used them. Federal prosecutors did not speak in slogans. They spoke in records, standards, liability, timelines. Shaw shifted his weight and folded his arms as if he could make the scene smaller by refusing to react to it. But the scene had already expanded beyond him. It lived now in the phones pointed at his badge, in the eyes of strangers, in the memory of the fluorescent lights shining down on a man who had done everything right and was still being held in place by someone else's certainty. Then Collins asked, quietly enough that only those nearest could hear, "Shaw, did dispatch confirm the plate?" For the first time that evening, Shaw did not answer immediately. The pause was brief, but devastating. Marcus heard it. Lena heard it. The bystanders might not have understood the exact question, but they understood silence when it arrived too late. Collins's face changed. Just slightly. Just enough. And in that instant, standing beneath the hard white lights with rain scents still hanging in the air, Marcus realized the evening had begun to shift. Not because justice had arrived all at once. Justice was rarely that merciful. But because one small crack had opened in the wall protecting a lie, and everybody standing there could feel the cold truth moving through it. Officer Collins did not repeat the question. He did not have to. The damage was already inside the silence. Around them, the parking lot seemed to sharpen at the edges, every sound suddenly cleaner, every face more alert. Rainwater shimmered in the painted lines. The fluorescent lights above the storefront hummed with a sterile brightness that made the scene feel less like an accident and more like evidence waiting to be collected. Marcus Ellison stood exactly where he had been standing, shoulders straight, hands relaxed at his sides, while the truth began to separate itself from the performance around him. Officer Shaw finally answered, but the confidence had thinned from his voice. "Dispatch is still checking." Collins stared at him for half a second too long. "Still checking." He repeated, lower this time, and now the words sounded less like confirmation and more like disbelief. Lena Brooks felt a chill crawl up her arms despite the hospital sweatshirt under her jacket. She had seen enough tense moments in emergency rooms to recognize when a room changed shape. This was that moment. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shift in gravity. Shaw had counted on certainty to carry him. Now certainty was gone, and all that remained was what he had actually done in front of witnesses. Marcus looked from Collins to Shaw and then briefly toward Lena's phone, not directly into the lens, just enough to acknowledge that the truth no longer belonged only to the people in uniform. "Officer Collins," he said, "I would like the record to reflect that I presented identification before you arrived and that no verified basis for this detention has been articulated." Collins blinked once. The sentence landed hard because it was not spoken like a threat. It was spoken like a door closing on a bad argument. Somewhere behind the crowd, a car alarm chirped as someone unlocked their vehicle, then stopped. Nobody moved. Even the automatic doors seemed to open onto a world farther away now. Marcus's words had done something larger than defend himself. They had named the moment for what it was. Collins straightened and stepped aside just enough to angle himself away from Shaw. "Sir," he said to Marcus, more respectful now, "do you have your business card?" Marcus gave the smallest nod, reached slowly into his wallet again, and handed over a cream-colored card. Thick stock, clean lettering, understated in the way real institutions often are. Collins read it once, then again. Assistant United States Attorney. Civil Rights Division Liaison. Marcus watched the title register without satisfaction. He did not enjoy the reveal. That was the ache of evenings like this. Dignity should have been enough. The card should have changed nothing, because groceries in a trunk and a calm answer in a parking lot should already have been enough to earn ordinary treatment. But in America, sometimes the system only listened once status translated a man's humanity into language it respected. Collins lowered the card slowly. "You are with the federal office downtown," he said. "Yes," Marcus answered. "For 11 years. The mother by the SUV let out a breath she had clearly been holding. One of the red apron employees muttered, "Oh my God," under his breath. The teenage boys looked at each other with wide eyes, as if the whole scene had suddenly tipped into a story they would repeat for years. Lena kept filming, but now her grip had changed. At first she had recorded out of concern. Now she recorded out of responsibility. Collins turned to Shaw. There was no aggression in the movement, only a growing distance. "This needs to end," he said quietly. Shaw's expression hardened, then flickered. For the first time all evening, he looked less like an officer in control and more like a man calculating consequences too late. He glanced at the crowd, at the phones, at Marcus, at the open trunk with the daisies and the groceries and the life that should have gone uninterrupted. Then something even more devastating happened. Dispatch came over the radio. The voice was mechanical, flat, impossible to argue with. Plate returns clean. Registered owner matches identification. No active theft report linked to vehicle. The words drifted out into the cold evening air and seemed to hang there above the blacktop like a final piece of light. Nobody in the crowd needed legal training to understand what they meant. The stop had not just become questionable. It had collapsed. Collins's face went pale beneath the parking lot lights. Lena's phone caught Shaw looking away. Marcus did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply stood there with that same terrible calm, the kind that made everything around him look smaller. And in that moment, Officer Shaw learned the cruelest truth of all, that the man he had tried to reduce in public was now the one person in the lot who had no need to raise his voice, because the facts were finally speaking for him. For a long second, nobody moved. The radio had already said what mattered, and the truth, once spoken by an indifferent machine, had a way of stripping every human excuse down to its bare frame. The parking lot remained washed in harsh white light, every puddle reflecting the glow from the Freshmart sign, every face held still inside the strange quiet that comes when a public life finally breaks apart in front of witnesses. Officer Collins was the first to act. He took one step back from Marcus, lowered his shoulders, and spoke in a voice that no longer carried official distance. "Sir, you are free to go." It was a simple sentence, but even as it landed, everyone standing there could feel how small it was compared to what had just happened. Marcus Ellison did not reach for triumph. He did not let relief rush across his face. He only looked at Collins, then at Officer Shaw, and finally toward the open trunk where the groceries still waited in the cold like unfinished proof of an ordinary evening stolen for no reason. The daisies had shifted again in the wind. One bright yellow petal clung to the damp lip of a paper bag. Marcus stepped slowly toward the trunk and placed his wallet back inside his jacket. His movements were steady, but inside, something heavier had begun to settle. Not fear, not rage, something older than both. Fatigue, maybe. The private exhaustion of a man who had spent years inside the machinery of justice and still found himself standing beneath grocery store lights having to prove, yet again, that he belonged in his own life. Lena kept recording, though now her hand shook for a different reason. The danger had passed, but the meaning of it had not. She watched Marcus bend slightly to straighten one of the paper bags, his fingers pausing on the chamomile tea, then on the prescription cream, then on the flowers meant for a mother who still had no idea why her son was late. There was a tenderness in that small gesture that made the whole scene feel sharper. He had not come here looking for a fight. He had come here carrying care. That was what made the humiliation so plain. Collins cleared his throat. "Sir," he said again, more carefully this time, "I apologize for the inconvenience." Marcus turned his head and looked at him fully. The word inconvenience hung in the air and failed under its own weakness. A few people in the crowd seemed to feel it too. The mother by the SUV tightened her mouth. One of the red apron employees looked down at the ground. Lena's face hardened. Marcus did not embarrass Collins for saying it. He did not need to. "This was not an inconvenience," he said quietly. His voice was almost soft, but every person near enough to hear it felt the weight in it. This was a public misuse of authority. Collins had no answer to that. Shaw looked away toward the storefront windows, where his reflection stood stretched and pale in the glass, broken by door frames and sale posters. He still had not apologized. He had not asked if Marcus was all right. He had not looked once at the groceries, the flowers, the witnesses, or the woman still filming from 10 feet away. Pride had not left him. It had only gone silent. Marcus let the quiet sit there. Then he did something that unsettled the crowd more than anger would have. He reached into the trunk, took out the bouquet of yellow daisies, and gently set them upright so they would not bruise in the ride home. That simple act, done beneath the bright lot lights while 2 patrol cars stood nearby, drew a sharp breath from Lena. It was such a small thing, but it carried everything. He was still thinking about his mother, still choosing tenderness in a place that had offered him none. Collins glanced at Shaw, then back at Marcus. "There will be an incident report," he said, as if offering the first piece of structure he could find. Marcus nodded once. "There will be more than that." The words were not spoken like a threat. They were spoken like weather. Certain. Inevitable. Lena lowered the phone for the first time and looked directly at Marcus. Their eyes met for only a second, but it was enough. He knew she had seen everything. She knew he understood what that meant. Around them, the bystanders began to drift, slowly at first, like a tide pulling back from shore. But the moment did not dissolve with them. It remained in the wet blacktop, in the fluorescent glare, in the radio call that had cleared him too late, in the silence of the officer who could not undo what had already been done. Marcus closed the trunk with one calm motion, flowers secured, groceries inside, and stood facing the two patrol cars one last time. The evening air had turned colder now. Somewhere beyond the lot, traffic moved steadily toward dinner tables and warm kitchens and houses where people were already taking off their shoes. Marcus should have been one of them. Instead, as he reached for his car door, he realized the night was not ending here. It was only beginning. Marcus drove home through streets blurred by moisture and traffic light reflections, the windshield wipers moving in a soft metronome that seemed to measure everything the evening had taken from him. In the passenger seat, the yellow daisies rested against the paper bags, their petals catching the glow from passing storefronts and gas station signs. The groceries were still cold. The tea was still there. The soup had not spilled. It would have looked, to anyone glancing through the window, like the most ordinary drive in the world. But Marcus felt the weight of the parking lot following him all the way across town, not as panic, not even as anger, but as a deep, familiar sorrow that sat quietly behind his ribs. By the time he turned into his mother's driveway, the porch light was already on. It spilled a warm square across the cracked concrete path, and the trimmed hedges. She still insisted on shaping herself every spring even though her hands hurt afterward. He parked, turned off the engine, and sat in the dark for one extra second, fingers resting on the wheel. The house in front of him was small, brick, unremarkable, the kind of place most people drove past without noticing. But to Marcus it had always felt like the one place in the world where he did not have to translate himself before walking through the door. He gathered the bags, lifted the flowers carefully, and stepped into the cold evening air. The front door opened before he could knock. His mother, Naomi Ellison, stood there in her soft gray cardigan and house slippers, her silver hair wrapped in a scarf the color of lavender, concern already filling her eyes before she said a word. "You are late," she said, and then softer. "Marcus, what happened?" He tried to smile, but she had always been able to read the truth before it reached his mouth. He carried the groceries in and set them on the kitchen counter beneath the yellow light over the sink. The room smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood polish. A dish towel hung from the oven handle. The kettle sat ready on the stove. Everything about the room felt gentle, unchanged, mercifully untouched by the cruelty of parking lot lights and public suspicion. Marcus placed the daisies in her hands. Naomi looked at them, then at him. Her gaze dropped to his wrists, where the evening had left faint marks, not dramatic, just enough for a mother to see. She inhaled slowly. For a moment neither of them spoke. Outside, a car passed on the road beyond the hedges. Inside, the refrigerator hummed, steady and low. Naomi set the flowers down on the table and touched his sleeve with the lightest pressure. "Sit," she said. Marcus obeyed. He sat at the kitchen table where he had done homework as a boy, where she had balanced bills with a pencil tucked behind her ear, where she had once told him that dignity was something no one could hand him and no one had the right to take. She filled the kettle and placed it on the burner. The click of the gas flame felt louder than usual. "Tell me," she said. So he did. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just the facts first, because facts were how he had learned to survive difficult things. The stop. The questions. The bystanders. The phone cameras. The second officer. The radio call. Then the quieter parts came. The fatigue. The humiliation of having to become impressive before being allowed to become innocent. Naomi listened without interrupting, her hands folded in front of her, eyes fixed on him with that painful mixture of pride and heartbreak only mothers seem able to carry at the same time. When he finished, the kettle had begun to murmur. Steam drifted upward between them like something trying to rise clean out of a hard day. Naomi stood, made the tea exactly the way he liked it, and placed the mug before him. Then she looked at him and said, very softly, "You did not lose yourself out there." Marcus lowered his eyes for a second. That was the thing he had needed most, though he had not known it until she said it. Not reassurance that the officers had been wrong. Not even comfort that the witnesses had seen. But the quiet confirmation that in the middle of humiliation, he had remained fully himself. He wrapped his hands around the mug and let the heat settle into his palms. On the kitchen table, the daisies leaned toward the light. Naomi reached across, covering one of his hands with hers. "What happens now?" she asked. Marcus looked at the steam rising from the tea, then toward the dark window above the sink where his reflection hovered faintly against the night. He thought of Lena Brooks holding her phone steady when she had no reason to risk anything for a stranger. He thought of Officer Collins hearing the silence too late. He thought of Derek Shaw standing beneath those hard white lights with nowhere left to hide once the facts arrived. When Marcus finally answered, his voice was calm enough to sound almost like prayer. "Now," he said, "the truth goes on record." Naomi said nothing after that. She only squeezed his hand once and let the silence do what silence sometimes does best, hold the weight without dropping it. Outside, the wind moved lightly through the hedges. Inside, the kettle clicked as it cooled. The flowers stood bright and unbroken at the center of the table, and in their quiet yellow stillness, the whole room seemed to breathe with him.